Welcome to Unit 5. In this unit, we're looking at chapters 11 and 12, so we will discuss race and ethnicity, gender, sex, and sexuality. Most of you coming into a sociology class have heard, of course, of the terms race and ethnicity and minority groups. But these three terms are very distinct. They are very separate from each other according to sociologists. Now, most people tend to use them interchangeably and thinking they are the same thing, but while they are all connected, I want you to know that they are distinctly three separate things. So let's just look first at racial group and ethnic group. A racial group is a group that is set apart from others because of physical differences that have taken on a social significance. So, for example, skin color would be one significant physical difference that determines one race from the other. So, for example, of course, you have the skin color of white, so you have this racial group of whites, and then you have the skin color of black or dark brown, and you have that as African Americans, or you may even have the olive colored skin, and so that could be either Asians or Mediterranean. So a racial group is set by physical differences. Now, an ethnic group are set apart primarily because of either the national origin or cultural patterns. So an ethnic group can have different racial groups within it. So I really want you to know the difference between these two, that race is set on physical attributes while ethnicity is set on nation of origin or a cultural way of being. Now, when we look at race, I want you to look at a term or concept called social construction of race. Now, the social construction of race is the process by which people come to define a group as a race based on physical characteristics, as well as maybe the historical element of the group or cultural pattern or economic factors. So, social construction of race, while race is identified as a physical attribute of a group, the term race itself is a socially constructed term. So if you were to be asked a question on a test such as, is the term race a biological term or is it a social term? The answer is actually social, because it is the social group that identifies what is race and what biological attributes are attributed that would define the word race. Now, one thing that I want you to know when we're discussing race is the recognition of multiple identities. Now, we've already studied W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of double consciousness, if you remember back in chapter 1, which was about how to be two distinct identities. So how is it that a black person can remain and hold on to what is that of being black while in a world that at the time was distinctly white? Now today we still have that issue. It's not near as broad and big as it was in the days prior to the Civil War and this even into the Civil Rights Movement. So that gap has kind of closed here more and more as we move on, although mainstream media and certain groups don't want you to think that it has. They distinctly want you to keep thinking that the two races are so far apart. But you know, if you walk away from all of that and just look out into your neighborhood and look out into your community, you'll see that there's more of a closeness. But let's get back to this recognition of multiple identities. Racial formation refers to the socio-historical process in which racial categories are created, changed, and or gotten rid of. So, for example, the trend in the U.S. tends to be accepting of multiple identities. And basically what this means is we are now having biracial and triracial going into quadracial people. Now, this is one thing that W.E.B. Du Bois predicted, was that the color line would disappear because eventually we would all be coming together and mixing together to where there's not a distinct white or black or Asian or Hispanic. So look at Tiger Woods, Mariah Carey, former President Barack Obama. I mean, we can look at all of these and see biracial. And what does that mean to be biracial? To that person, my son's, one of my son's best friends is biracial. And so he has to move through life identifying with his father's side of the family, which is African American, and his mother's side of the family, which is white. And how do you maneuver? How do you maneuver between the two worlds? How do you be one person with all of them? Or do you have to kind of pick and choose? Now, W.E.B. Du Bois stated that, again, eventually the color line would be blurred. So we have the biracial, which could be, for example, the most common, a white and an African American get together and they have a child. Or you could do an African American and a Hispanic, or a white or a Hispanic, or whatever it may be, and they have a child. That child is biracial. So let's just stick with white and African American. They have a child that's biracial. Then that biracial child grows up, and let's say they have a child with a Hispanic. That child now is triracial. They are part white, part African American, part Hispanic. So this trying to have multiple identities. How do you identify with what is your heritage while at the same time being a participant in all of them? So that is something that we look at. Now, approximately 2.6% of people in the United States report that they have two or more races. So you're looking at the multiple racial identities here. Now, I'm going to talk later on about stereotypes and how this can come into play with biracial or triracial individuals. But let's look at ethnicity real quick. Now again, ethnicities are set apart by their national origin or distinctive cultural pattern. So an ethnic group would be identified by things such as their heritage, their language, their religion, their views, or the country or area of the world in which they come from. So I do want you to know the difference between a race and ethnicity. So now let's look at minority groups. A minority group is defined as any group of people who, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, are singled out from the others in society in which they live for differential or unequal treatment, and therefore regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. Now that seems a lot, so I really just want you to know that it is a subordinate group whose members are singled out from others for differential or unequal treatment. Now, when we look at minority groups, we look at a numerical minority is a group that makes up less than half of a larger population. So a minority in the sociological sense is a subordinate group whose members have a significantly less control or power over their own lives than members of a dominant or majority group. So a minority group now can be based upon, as I just said, population number. So if the majority of people in a group are, let's just say, white, and then a small number is Black or Asian or Hispanic, then the smaller number groups are going to be considered minority. Now, it can be based on other things such as religion. If the majority of the people in a group are Christians, and then you have groups of people that are Jewish and Hindu and Islamic and Buddhist, then those are going to be the minority group. So you place it on the population numbers or the numbers in the groups themselves to determine what is a minority group. Now, sociologists have identified 5 basic properties of minority groups. 1, members of a minority group experience unequal treatment. 2, minority group members share physical or cultural characteristics different from the dominant group. 3, minority group membership is not voluntary or ascribed. It is automatically given. 4, minority members have a strong sense of group solidarity. And 5, minority members generally marry from within the same group. Now we're looking at that. Number 5, some of these have changed or are changing. We can see that in society. So let's just kind of look at it. Number 1 said about unequal treatment. Well, we now have laws against that and discrimination. And so we see people of minority groups who are moving forward and moving up and having the same opportunities and the same type of lifestyles as what the dominant group has. So we're seeing that unequal treatment shrinking. Again, you're going to be pushed from outside forces to think otherwise. But if you take a good look, there are always issues here and there of certain people giving unequal treatment to certain groups. Now, one of the things that we'll discuss is prejudice and discrimination goes in circles. Every group has members in it that are discriminatory. So, but again, that unequal treatment is changing. It's shrinking just a little bit if you take a true look at how things are. The second was, of course, they have physical and cultural characteristics different from the dominant group. Well, again, as we start all melding together, that's going to shrink and no longer become a problem. Minority group members are automatically ascribed, so that's not going to change. That is something that just because of who you are or some kind of attribute, you automatically are placed in that group. Okay, and then of course, again, minority members generally marry from within the same group. We're starting to see that change. We're starting to see that change. The number 1 cultural aspect that we are not seeing that change in a huge significance is religion. That still seems to be predominantly true. It's called endogamy. So most people tend to marry someone within the same religion. Now, it doesn't mean it always has to be that way, but we still see that one kind of holding true. But as far as race and ethnicity and other aspects, we're starting to see that kind of go away and people are broadening out from those groups. Now, I've been talking about the terms subordinate group and dominant group, so you need to know those. Of course, the subordinate group is a group that is in the minority, and then the dominant group is the group that's in the majority. So you're going to look at that, and if you watch what is going on in society, if you watch how things are evolving and changing, then you'll see the dynamics of the dominant group changing in the dynamics of the minority groups, and sometimes the minority groups become the dominant group and vice versa. So just know that a minority group is a subordinate group whose members typically experience differential or unequal treatment of some sort and are set apart for some attribute from the dominant group. When we are talking about race and ethnicity, we need to learn the difference between stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and racism. So let's look at stereotypes. Stereotypes are oversimplified generalizations about groups of people. Now, they can be based on a multiple set of things, and I've listed some here: race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, religion. It can be based on behavior, the way a person dresses. Again, they are oversimplified or overgeneralization about a group of people. Now, the stereotype itself is applied to all members of a group, even though that may not apply to individuals within that group. So, for example, if you have a group of people who the majority of the group of people are going to dress a certain way, then you're going to assume that all members of that group dress that way. And so when you see an individual, you're going to stereotype them as dressing a certain way or looking a certain way simply because they're a member of a group. Now, the problem with that is stereotypes do not take into account the individuality of a person. So stereotypes are just placed upon all members of a group, whether that is true or not. Now, stereotypes can be a positive or a negative stereotype. So a positive could be that this certain group is very artistic or very talented in a certain ability, or this group tends to, seem to be smarter in certain school subjects. Or a positive could be that if you have this certain career, then you are seen in a certain light. So stereotypes can be positive, or for the most part, most of the time, stereotypes are a negative. And so either way, again, the stereotype is a generalization and it doesn't take individual differences into account. So think about the stereotypes that you have. We all stereotype people. It is automatic. It is just one way that our brain kind of automatically wraps around meeting a person or seeing a person, kind of gives you an idea of what to expect or what to think of them. And then, of course, as you get to know them, you will learn whether the stereotype is true or not. So we as individuals all have stereotyped other people, and we all have had stereotypes placed on us. So just know the difference of stereotypes and how they are connected to groups of people. Let's look at prejudice, racism, and discrimination. Now, prejudice is the belief or thoughts held about a certain group. It can be a positive or a negative. Most people think of prejudice in a negative attitude towards an entire category of people. Okay, but prejudice can also be a positive. So we just have to look at what it is and what's being applied. Again, most people think of them as negative, and most prejudice are negative, but there are positive ones. Now, prejudice tends to perpetuate false definitions about individuals or groups, and then ethnocentrism actually comes into this when we have the tendency to assume that our own group or way of life is superior over another, which we're going to talk about that in the definition of racism. But when we look at prejudice, we must keep in mind that a prejudice is not based on experience. Instead, it is a prejudgment. Now, I will argue that a prejudice can come from an experience. Most sociologists don't, but it could be that a person experiences something either positive or negative with a group of people or a member of a certain group, and then based upon that experience, they then have a prejudged belief or thought or idea about that group. So I will argue that prejudice can come from experience, although most sociologists will tell you that it's not. So while prejudice is not necessarily specific to race, it can be prejudiced against gender, sex, religion. We even have prejudice against different types of jobs and careers. Racism is based on race. It is the belief that one race is superior than another. Now, in today's use of the term racism, it refers to anything also related to the color of skin. But the actual definition of racism is the belief that one racial category of people is superior or inferior to other people. Okay, and then of course, as I just said, today it's also related to color of skin. Now, the one thing that I want you to know about racism is all racial groups have people in them who are racist. You have been pushed to believe that only white people can be racist, and that is incorrect. All groups of people have racist people within them. There are members of every racial group that think that their group is superior or better than the other, and there are members of every racial group that dislike other groups simply based on arbitrary factors such as skin color and that sort of thing. So racism is circular. It is not linear. It does not go in one direction. It flows in all directions, and every racial group of people have racist people within them. You will also hear thrown around the term reverse racism. There is no such thing as reverse racism. Okay, reverse racism, the term was created when there would be a situation in which a minority group is very obviously being racist against the majority group. So then they created the term, well, this is just reverse racism. Okay, again, there isn't such a thing. Racism is racism regardless of what direction it comes from. The term reverse racism is used to perpetuate the idea that only white people can be racist, which again is not true. Now, when we talk about racism, I want you to understand institutional racism, and then you also have individual racism. Now, institutional racism refers to the way in which racism is embedded into the fabric or the core of a society. Okay, so this is institutional. It's kind of like it's the big umbrella. It covers the whole society, and it's embedded into the way society does things. That is called institutional racism. And then you have what is individual racism and individual discrimination, which we'll talk later on, which is actually one person's specific thoughts and actions or beliefs against another person, but it's not widespread. Now, when we look at racism and prejudice, we also must learn the term colorism. Now, colorism is another kind of prejudice in which someone believes one type of skin color is superior or inferior with another set. Okay? With colorism, we also need to understand what it means to have colorblind racism. Now, colorblind racism is a term to use of a principle of race neutrality to defend a racially unequal status quo. So really, colorblind racism is a term that is being used at people who may or may not be racist, and really may not be racist, may not care what color a person's skin is, but then the other proponent, the other person is saying, well, you really are racist, you just really don't know that you're racist. And so we call this colorblind racism because there are a lot of people who truly are out there saying they don't really care what a color of a person's skin is, and they really mean it. But then the proponent of that is, well, you're saying you don't see color of skin, but you really do see the color of skin, and you act accordingly. Now, I personally have had this basically thrown at me in an example in which I was in my doctorate program, and there was a particular lady, a fellow student in my class, and she made everything out to be an issue of black and white. And when I say everything, she made everything out to be it. We got into a discussion one time of how we approach and treat other people, and numerous of us, black and white, really said it didn't bother us what the person's skin color was, and that we talked about within our small cohort there how we all just interchangeably interacted with each other, and we really didn't see a difference. And so someone said, I don't see the color of someone's skin when I interact with them. And this one particular student said, when we hear a white person say that, we know they're lying. That is colorblind racism. And so I stepped up and stated that when a person says that they don't see the color of someone's skin, they're not saying literally they don't see the color of skin. It's that the color of skin does not matter to us. And I use the example that in our class, and in this specific class we were talking in, our professor from UGA happened to be African American. And so I said, when I am talking to people or when I'm looking around the classroom, I don't see Dr. Womble, my African American professor, and I don't see Sheila, my African American fellow student, and I don't see Jason sitting right next to me as the young African American teacher who's trying to get his doctorate degree. And I don't see my friend Jennifer over here as the white student who is my friend, and I don't see Michael, who's sitting next to her, as her white brother. Do I know that people are white and black? Yes, but when I see them, I simply see Dr. Womble, my professor at UGA, Sheila and Jason and Jennifer and Mike as my fellow students, or my fellow friends. Again, not ignoring the color of skin, but that is not how I first identify them as. And so you're having this argument or perspectives on two different groups. One group sees skin color and that is predominant in everything. And the other group sees it, but that isn't the predominant factor. So this is why we have this divide of perspectives when it comes to race in society today. So I just wanted you to know the term color blindness, color racism, and colorism when we go to discuss about prejudice. Let's move on to discrimination. While prejudice refers to a biased way of thinking, a certain thought or belief about a group of people, whether positive or negative, discrimination consists of actions. Okay, so prejudice is a thought process, discrimination is actions. Actions against a group of people. Now, most of the time, discrimination is negative. Okay, so it is the denial of opportunity usually is how discrimination works. So while, again, prejudice and discrimination can overlap, I want you to fully understand that there are people out there who can be prejudiced but do not discriminate. There are people out there who are not prejudiced and will not discriminate. There are people who are prejudiced and discriminate. So there's all different types of people out there. Again, in society today, we are being pushed that groups are all prejudiced and always discriminating no matter what. But I want you to see 4 different categories or 4 examples of prejudice and discrimination and how they occur. Now, the first is unprejudiced non-discriminators. So these are people who do not hold a prejudiced thought and do not discriminate. They are open-minded, tolerant, and accepting of other people. You have unprejudiced discriminators. So this is someone who doesn't necessarily have a negative thought or belief about a group of people, but will still discriminate. Your book used the example of how maybe a male may not have a prejudiced thought against women, but when it comes to promotion, he only promotes men. So, that is possible. It is very possible to be unprejudiced, but also discriminate. The third type is prejudiced non-discriminators. So these are people who have a prejudiced idea or thought about a group of people, but they don't act on it. So for example, that could be someone who has a negative prejudiced or a racist belief against a group of people, yet they own a store and they still sell their products to members of that group. So they're prejudiced but non-discriminatory. Okay, and then the last then of course is a person who is prejudiced and discriminates, so they actively have this negative thought or belief about a group of people and they negatively act upon them. So know what discrimination is and know these four kind of categories or types of people, how prejudice and discrimination are interlinked with each other. Intergroup relations, which just means relationships between different groups of people, range on the spectrum between tolerance and intolerance. So the most tolerant form of intergroup relations is called pluralism, in which no distinction is made between minority or majority groups, but instead there's an equal standing. We're going to talk about pluralism in just a moment. At the other end of this spectrum, though, are amalgamation, expulsion, and even genocide, which are stark examples of intergroup relations that are intolerant of each other. So let's just look at some of these terms. Genocide is the deliberate annihilation of a targeted, usually a subordinate group, and it is the most toxic form of intergroup relationships that we see. So, looking back in history, possibly the most well-known case of genocide, of course, is Hitler's with his attempt to exterminate the Jewish people. So, the Holocaust. We also have treatment in the, I think, late 1800s up into the early 1900s in Australia, where Aboriginal Australians were being killed and forced out. In the United States history, we have European settlers, of course, with the American Indians forcing them off their land. Now, genocide is not just a historical concept. It's practiced today. With ethnic and graphic conflicts, we've got in the Darfur region of the Sudan has led to hundreds of thousands of people dying. We've got ongoing conflict in but in Sudan there is, in the Congo there is, we've got Sierra Leone that has genocide happening. In the early 1990s, you had the Serbs in Croatia, what used to be Yugoslavia. 1994, of course, we had the Rwandan civil war between the Tutsis and the Hutu. So genocide is just the deliberate systematic killing of an entire group of people or nation. Now, expulsion refers to a subordinate group being forced by a dominant group to leave a certain area or country. They're not being killed, however, they are being forced to leave. So again, the Holocaust is an example of both expulsion and genocide, because many Jews that weren't killed were forced to move. And again, the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee Indians in the United States. Now, with segregation, segregation is the physical separation of two groups based upon some type of factor. It can be done in the workplace, in social functions. It's usually just the segregation is forced by law or a de facto law, which occurs without laws, but other factors contribute to it. So of course we know in our history of the segregation between blacks and whites. And so that is another form of intergroup relations. Now in some countries segregation still exists. It is against the law in the United States and isn't practiced so much. However, what we're seeing now is this movement lately, in the last probably 8 to 10 years, we've seen this movement of African Americans and whites, instead of melding together and doing things together, we're now starting to see this separation again, where there are, for example, there are African American all-black pageants, or schools that are strictly African American, or TV shows or channels that are all African American. There's business programs and business loans for African American businesses. And so all of a sudden now we're starting to see a distinction being made between blacks and whites, and that is nothing more than segregation. When one group says, only people of a specific attribute can be a part of this, and anyone else who doesn't have that attribute can't. That's segregation. So we're kind of seeing this now happening just a little bit more. As sociologists, we're watching this. College campuses are huge on it. They have these areas or these spaces where only non-white students can go, or only non-white students are invited to be a part of. And so we're watching this. And again, sociologists, this is what we do. We watch what's happening due to social forces. So genocide, expulsion, and segregation all happen in intergroup relationships. Now what we see with the world and globalization and travel being easier and people being able to move about, we see what is called pluralism in many, many different countries. Now, the United States wasn't initially meant to be pluralism. It happened. We'll notice that a lot of people actually assimilated into the American culture, but pluralism existed then, and it kind of exists now. We see it more today than we did in the history. But let's look. Pluralism is represented by the idea that different groups mix together, but each group keeps its own identity, yet contributes to the group as a whole. So really what we see is multiple different groups who are interacting with each other, and they mix together, but each group keeps its own way of being in its own identity, but all the groups work together as a whole to make one group. So this is known as the salad bowl metaphor, basically a great mixture of different cultures where each one retains its own and then adds to the flavor of the overall culture. So this is what we see. So if you ever hear of the salad bowl metaphor, it's talking about pluralism. So an example here that I give you is Group A plus Group B plus Group C still equals 3 different groups, but each of these 3 different groups work together kind of like under one umbrella, and that is pluralism. Now, 2 other things can happen in intergroup relations. That's assimilation and amalgamation. So assimilation is when a minority group gives up its own identity and or cultural ways and becomes part of the dominant culture. So that is when someone moves from one culture to another culture, and then they no longer practice their old ways, but then they take on the ways of the new dominant culture. So the example I have here is Group A, which is the dominant, plus Group B, which is the subordinate, would equal Group A. So Group B gives up its way of being in order to become part of Group A. Now, amalgamation happens when a majority group and a minority group combine to form a new group altogether, and that is called the melting pot. So group A plus group B plus group C all give up their former ways, and they come together and unite, and they form a whole new group, which would be group D. Now let's take a look at gender and sex and sexuality, which will be chapter 12. There's a term that I want you to know, which is called the social construction of gender. And social construction of gender is really how a person becomes to learn and identify with a particular gender. Now, we do know that in today's society, there is this huge movement of that there's now some 60-some genders that are out there, and gender identity, and so we're seeing this more and more, and we're going to talk about gender identity, which of course is an internal perception of whether a person is masculine or feminine. But I want to start off with distinction between the term sex and the term gender, because people in society use the two interchangeably as if they're the same thing, and they're really not. And so once you understand that there is a difference between them, you can now start to see where this whole gender identity movement is coming from, and then the arguments for and against it. So let's look at sex. Now, sex is your physical or your physiological difference of male and females. So it's naturally defined, and it is determined by your primary sex characteristics, which is your reproductive system. And then you have secondary characteristics, which would be your height and your weight, your body build, that sort of thing. So your sex is your physical attributes, your primary sex characteristic. So if you have a penis, you are a male. If you have a vagina, you are a female. That is the naturally defined term for sex, male and female. Now, gender, on the other hand, is not physical attributes. It is behaviors or traits associated with being male or female. It is socially defined, not biologically defined. So gender then is what is masculine and feminine. Okay, so now you can see when someone says there are two genders, how one side says yes, there really are only two genders, masculine and feminine, that coordinate or go along with the two sexes, male and female. But now there are others who say that while there may be two sexes, there are multiple genders. And so then the gender identity movement comes in, where someone can be transgendered, which is a person who changes or thinks of themselves as the opposite sex. So you could have a female who is transgendered into male, so while she stays female, she may act and associate everything as male, or vice versa. Now, transsexuals are people who actually go under medical intervention in order to change the biological aspects of themselves to be associated with the other sex. And then, of course, just Google and look up all the different types of genders that there are out there now. You've got your pangenders and non-genders and shifting gender, and so there's all kinds of different identities out there. How you feel about this is going to be a personal falling on the spectrum of all of this, but now that you see that the two terms really are not the same thing, you now can see when someone says follow the science for gender, what they're saying is gender is either masculine or feminine, again coordinating with the two sexes, male or female, but then others are saying no, gender is, since it is socially created and defined, there can be more than two genders. Now, when we look at sexual orientation is a person's physical, mental, emotional, and sexual attraction to a particular sex, male or female. Okay? It is usually divided into one of four categories, which is heterosexuality, which is a person who is emotionally, physically, mentally, and sexually attracted to the opposite sex. Homosexuality is you have that attraction to the same sex. Bisexuality means you are attracted to both male and female. And then asexuality means you have no attraction to either. So the sexual orientation is simply the physical, mental, emotional, and sexual attraction towards a particular sex, and then you will fall into one of these four categories. Now, gender roles are the expectations or the behaviors that are attached to being male or female, or being masculine and feminine. So it is society's concept of how men and women are expected to look and behave, etc., jobs that they're supposed to do, things they're supposed to be interested in. Now, examples of gender roles for males and females, we're looking at girls identify in part more with families and neighbors and a more feminine self-image. They're expected to be softer and quieter and be passive. Women are expected to be mothers. They're expected to be successful at work, but not quite as successful as males. Male gender, socially constructed, but boys are more masculine, so they pick the more physical sports, the more physically labored jobs. They're encouraged to be aggressive and self-reliant. They're encouraged to do the yard work, while the females are encouraged to do the housework. So we do see gender roles coming into play even in schools, where girls are pushed more towards the softer sciences, where males are pushed more towards the hard sciences, math, biology, chemistry, engineer, where the female students tend to go more towards the social sciences, education, nursing, and that sort of thing. But we're starting to see a mixture of it all. And gender roles literally are just the expected behaviors of being male or being female. I touched base a little bit on gender identity in the first slide for this chapter, but again, transgendered is a person who is of one biological sex but identifies with the gender of the opposite sex. So again, it could be a male who identifies more with things that are supposed to be female, and vice versa, a female who then identifies more with things that are supposed to be male or masculine. Transsexuals then are an individual who goes under medical intervention to change the physical biological parts of themselves to identify with the opposite sex. Gender dysphoria then is simply the confusion or the not the confusion, but basically it's where a condition of people whose gender at birth is contrary to the one that they identify with. And I use the word confusion starting off, but that is basically how this starts, is the confusion of someone is born physically male but identifies things more female and vice versa. And so initially there is that confusion of, why am I more drawn to these things than I am these things? And so the gender dysphoria then is just that identity where the two don't match. What is physically the attribute of sex doesn't match with the gender that the individual identifies with. When we talk about sexism, most people will think the definition of sexism is prejudice, discrimination, typically against women. Now, let me tell you that prejudice and discrimination are results of sexism, but it is not the definition of sexism. The definition of sexism is the belief that one sex is superior or valued over the other. Okay, now again, prejudice and discrimination are results of sexism and stereotypes. Now, let's keep in mind why most of the time when we see sexism out in society, we attribute it to males being sexist against females. That is because our society has been predominantly patriarchal or predominantly male orientated, but over the years and as our society and culture has evolved, females now have the same opportunities and that sort of thing as males do. So today, males and females can be sexist, and it's not just males being sexist against females. As a matter of fact, I have met plenty of females who are sexist against males. And if you look at the current day feminist movement, that is a primary example of sexism against the males. Okay, so just again, sexism is the idea that one sex is superior or valued over the other. The results of sexism is prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyped.